Welcome to HowGood's Innovation Online series. This is one of the last in this initial series, and I'll tell you a bit about the next one that's coming up. Today we're focusing primarily on biodiversity, also on regenerative agriculture, also on planetary health. It's a good summary of many that we've been doing. Our guest is Arthur Gillett, the Director of Research at HowGood. And the overview, you like that picture, Arthur? The overview is that we're going to do an introduction, have this conversation. We'll do some interactive community breakouts and or Q&A. We may not take the whole hour today. Let's see how much Arthur and I get into disagreements about what we're talking about here. Then we'll wrap it up. I'll also point out that we have one upcoming session scheduled with the Executive Director of Biodiversity International and CIAT, the Alliance. Juan Lucas Restrepo will be talking about biodiversity from a very significant, big policy standpoint. He's been instrumental in working on science-based targets for biodiversity, which have not existed before. And we're moving quickly toward a place where there will be science-based targets for biodiversity along with carbon, along with water. So he'll tell us a bit about that and the work of Biodiversity International in October. Okay, I think that's good. I'll stop sharing and say welcome, Arthur. Thank you for joining today. And we really want to dig in on this idea of a forest delta in terms of carbon capture, doing life cycle assessments, and understanding what the real impact of agriculture is. We need to give some context so you understand a bit of the landscape that's out there currently in order to show and differentiate how new this idea is and what the implications of it are when we start to implement it. And so, Arthur, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the current state of modeling carbon footprints using life cycle assessment or similar tools. What does it currently look like? How is it currently done? And then maybe also, what are some of the challenges with that?
Yeah, we can get into that. The current state of Lca is, I mean, it's honestly very impressive. I was thinking about this and almost getting nervous when we were first training researchers at HowGood, and part of what we ended up doing was explaining the pros and cons of organic, and the main result in that ended up in like a giant loss of faith in organic, instead of an idea that organic was significant on certain things and less significant on others. And so with that in mind, as I talk about this, I want to make really clear that this is not me knocking Lca. This is seeing a room for growth. And because the way Lcas work right now is actually, I mean, it's really impressive. The ability to frame the issue and to clearly frame the limits to a system and to name those and talk about those and name the weaknesses there within the Lca report itself is incredibly useful and has been, is a huge part of the underlying data we use at HowGood. But the way it works is you have to define the boundaries of the system, right? And so within the boundaries of the system, you have inputs and outputs that, so a very easy thing to think about is if you're looking at a farm, you have inputs via fossil fuel inputs, via the implied fossil fuels that it takes to create, say, the fertilizer that is not a direct fossil fuel, but it was created by, needed energy from fossil fuels to create. You have the methane production from crop residues rotting. You have all sorts of things that are more and more granularly being accounted for over time as Lcas improve, as understanding of agriculture improves. But the really, the interesting thing is we're always looking for a baseline there, where we're looking for what is this more or less than? And Lcas as they currently stand are generally, I mean, there's some differences in the different methods and different kind of theories of how to build an LCA, how to do the calculations, but underlyingly, they're all driven by the difference between that and doing nothing. And so the assumption, especially when you're thinking about agriculture, if you're thinking about a factory process, if you don't run that process, it doesn't run. You don't input the energy. But with agriculture, it's a very interesting thing. That assumption actually doesn't hold true. If you do nothing to a field, many things happen, and those things happen to impact and affect the very things you're trying to measure in an LCA. So there's some really interesting tensions around LCAs in agriculture that do not exist around LCAs of a single process, like a factory process or something like that.
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize. So life cycle assessment science currently is quite amazing. It captures thousands of variables, you know, many different inputs, everything that happens on farm, everything that happens in the supply chains that go into the inputs that go onto the farm. So it's tracking out a huge number of variables, seeing what's happening in the growing of corn, in the growing of wheat, in the growing of avocados or apples, all the different things from the tractor moving, to the fertilizers being spread, to the work being done in harvesting, to the, even sometimes, depending where you draw the boundary, to the post-harvest processing and cleaning. And so it's taking into account a huge number of factors, but it's all of the comparisons that are done are basically against doing nothing. So it's sort of like, or comparing two against each other. So if I grow apples organically, or if I grow apples conventionally, which one is better or worse? Or you can even take a larger scale like we do at HowGood. We have a spectrum that says, here are all agricultural emissions that are out there, everything from, you know, carbon sequestering forest growing to the most intensive confined animal feeding operations for meat or dairy that produce a huge amount of carbon. So you can see those comparisons, but all of it is still being done against sort of a baseline of doing nothing. And I think what you're pointing towards is that might not be the right baseline, and that we might actually need to think about a bit like an opportunity cost of doing soy tillage agriculture or growing corn in a place, as opposed to what would happen if you didn't do that there.
Right. And so you're looking at the net difference rather than the impact of the action itself. It is different. The impact of the action itself on nothing is very different than the impact of that action on the actions that would happen if you didn't do anything. And it's almost like we end up comparing corn to wheat rather than comparing corn to something else, rather than comparing corn to ecology, right? And corn to wheat is interesting, or if you're me, it's interesting, but corn and wheat to ecology is way more interesting, right? And I think we get into another trap of LCAs, which is getting more and more effectively evaluated over time and investigated, which is, you know, we're all excited about studying the impact that we can assess, and there are places we have data and places we don't, right? And so soil sequestration, for one, is an area that we push into a lot, and we're always looking to understand what can happen there and what should happen there. And it's not well understood, right? The limits on a given type of soil's total amount of carbon it's able to hold change year to year right now, because the fact is those conditions change, the soil itself changes, our understanding of how deep we should measure, whether it makes sense to only measure a cubic meter, a cubic foot, 20 cubic meters. I mean, it's very difficult to understand exactly what our parameters are here and what makes sense, where we're actually having an impact and where we're not, what exists anyway, and so on. And so without that information, it's very tempting to say, okay, well, we know this is happening, but we can measure over here, you know, and we can do a good job measuring over here. And so there's always this question of, and I think LCAs by and large do a good job of this, of stating where the changes the possible impactful changes that you weren't able to measure are happening. And those changes are sometimes, immaterial. I mean, you'll often, if you're reading an LCA, you'll often see something that says, all food products go through this amount of, all similar food products go through the same amount of refrigeration and the same amount of transport. So we haven't included that in our modeling because it won't show the difference. And that makes sense, right? And so if at some point you're going, and we've done this a lot in the industry, we go, okay, well, all of these crops have similar tillage practices. So the carbon sequestration may or may not be happening, and we don't know exactly how good it is. So we'll just assume it's flat, or at least it's equal. And so it won't make a difference to our measurement. And that turned out to be a massive hole, right? And that's the hole that led us down this carbon opportunity cost exploration, is exploring how big a hole that is.
Right. So basically, it's easier to measure the gallons of gasoline used in your tractor or diesel used in your tractor, the pounds of fertilizers or tons of fertilizers that you put out, the tons of pesticides, the energy usage from your kilowatt hours in your bill from your farm. It's much easier to get measurements on that. And so the vast majority of agricultural LCAs for quite some time have modeled those and done a good job of them and assigned those impacts to the tons of wheat that come out, or the bushels of apples that come out, and normalize it to 1 kilogram, so you can see, okay, what is the actual CO2 emission, CO2 plus methane plus nitrates, so the CO2 equivalent emissions from this farm. But the things that were harder to measure, we just sort of left out, or like you just said, we assumed they were all the same. But it turns out, as we're starting to see more study of soil carbon and soil carbon sequestration, and soil carbon sequestration at different depths and in different forms, to ask us about how long it's going to stay there.
And in different climates.
Exactly. So that's only now coming into the LCA literature. And so the vast majority of what we have for the last 20 years doesn't take that into account very well. I think, how many studies do you think there are now, Arthur, that are actually looking at, like, doing a good job measuring and accounting for soil carbon sequestration as part of their calculations?
I mean, peer-reviewed LCA studies measuring carbon sequestration and not just modeling it, less than 30.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, and they're 30 groundbreaking, well-regarded, complex and confusing studies that are changing the shape of LCA. Like, LCA researchers are responding. This is not, a cry in the dark. This is an ongoing and rich conversation, but it's expensive and hard work to do. You can't just model it. You have to test it. You have to test the difference between high rainfall and low rainfall, between clay soils and sandy soils, between rotational grazing and flattened pasture use and no pasture use, and they're slow, right? That's a year later, 2 years later, what are the differences? And then you've taken those 30 samples, and I don't know, it's just slow work.
And
there's no way around it.
There has also been some work in tree-based agriculture, so tree-based perennial agriculture systems, to calculate the above ground biomass that is, for example, in the wood of the apple tree or in the wood of the palm tree, and account for that. But one of the challenges is, when you look at the IPCC and the 100-year global warming potential, oftentimes that material is not considered as carbon caught in long-term storage. Is that right?
Well, yes and no. It's not. It is in a way. It ends up being in the calculations as part of long-term storage when you account for land use change. So we actually there's a lot of work that's put into the reverse. The biggest impact you'll see in any crop, if you look crop by crop without differentiating, and you'll see some crops have these huge carbon CO2 equivalent numbers that seem kind of out of nowhere and don't make sense. And you're thinking, but this is a tree crop and it's grown and it should actually be carbon neutral or even carbon negative. Sorry. and you'll realize that those numbers are almost entirely driven by land use change. So we do have, and land use change is a mixture of loss of biomass directly, above ground biomass, and ongoing loss of in-soil carbon.
Okay, and so
So it is, the reverse is accounted for.
Just to be clear on what land use change is, because it's a term that gets thrown around, how would you define it? And I think most of the time it means deforestation. Is that right? And,
yeah.
And how should we think about that?
Effectively, it's a stand-in for new deforestation, right? So, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because from a political standpoint, there's accusations that it's unfair that, say, the developed world deforested most of its farmland 100 years ago, so it's never penalized for this. And those are very real conversations. But yeah, it's new deforestation, and it's basically the loss of carbon directly to the atmosphere, or the addition of carbon to the atmosphere from the act of deforestation. And so the only above ground biomass that wouldn't be counted in that, in the way the assumptions are built, are above ground biomass that would go to long-term, like, building materials. So if you cut down a forest and that forest is being cut down for cropland, but 30% of the above ground biomass became wood for furniture or housing, then that would be considered long-term storage.
Got it. Okay. So current LCAs do take into account land use change when it's recent. And is that in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or it differs?
20 years. It's usually, I mean, that you can set your own assumptions in your own LCA always, but the industry standard practice, I would say, is the loss is amortized over 20 years. So if it has happened any time in the last 20 years, you would be accountable for however close you were to that.
Got it. So we do see land use change being figured in a negative way when looking at LCAs. We rarely, more and more, but not yet across the field for all of the agricultural LCAs we have, we don't take soil carbon sequestration into account as much. So I think this is getting us towards, what is this idea, this thing that we're calling the forest delta, which is sort of a carbon opportunity cost. What is this idea, and how would you sort of model or take it into effect when doing the life cycle assessment of, let's take a specific example, let's say of oats.
Okay, so let's say oats somewhere specific, right? So we have oats in Manitoba, yeah? So for oats in Manitoba, well, that's a terrible example because that would be plains. But anyway, we'll go with it anyway. So for oats in Manitoba, when we're doing an LCA for them, if forest had been recently cut down, there would be an amortized annual kind of carbon impact of having cut down that forest. But as we're doing an LCA now, we would never see that. So we would see the inputs and outputs. We could, let's say, in a very good and new LCA, we would have ideally measured values for carbon sequestration for let's say, a regeneratively grown oat crop in Manitoba. And we would have good ideas about what kind of sequestration was happening on an ongoing basis with actual measurements. But what we wouldn't, in the same way that we calculate for land use change for forest, we wouldn't, if we weren't managing the oats actively, the carbon sequestration in most environments would likely increase enormously, both above and below ground, right? Let's say in oats question, I don't know Manitoba's ecosystems that well, but let's pretend for now that the kind of best case scenario for an ecologically stable solution to that area would be a mature prairie, right? So mature prairie, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but mature prairie is responsible for binding actually an enormous amount of carbon per hectare per year. both above ground and below. There's actually arguments that its below ground ability to sequester carbon is beyond that of many forests, even though its above ground is much lower. So its above ground biomass is lower than a forest, obviously, but its below ground biomass is more stable, is the argument. Well, I mean, this is all a little early in the process of having measured it globally for years and years and years to be confident in any of it. But the indications are that prairie is very efficient at creating stable carbon in subsoil carbon. And so you have a situation where by leaving it alone, there is an actual total and an implied annual amount of carbon that would be being sequestered, that would be being pulled out of the atmosphere, that would be, you know, in all these conversations about agriculture solving global warming, to the extent that they are real and pie in the sky, this is the part where measuring the difference between what the land would be doing and what it's doing with us becomes incredibly interesting. Because if we know what that figure is for prairie, and let's say it's sequestering 20 tons per hectare per year, right, of carbon. Now we have a target, right? Now, if we're going to grow oats, let's figure out a way to grow oats that gets close to 20 tons of carbon per year, per hectare per year. If oats isn't going to do it, and a system of oats and something else will, oats and peas, or, you know, or if we're going to talk about regenerative management of livestock, let's measure that livestock standards against prairie. Because then we know it's not that everything will do well, right? This may undermine certain arguments for certain crops, and it may move forward the arguments for other crops, but in lots of ways, this will change the baseline that we're testing against, and changing the baseline you're testing against always changes the results, right? Or almost always changes the results.
Okay, so basically, instead of just looking at oats and say, well, oats are a low carbon crop, relatively on the scale, let's say just kilograms per kilogram, it's not the 70 kilograms of CO2 equivalents emitted for some forms of animal agriculture. It's not even the 10 kilograms of CO2 equivalents that are emitted per kilogram of say, cashews or something like that. We're saying oats are low carbon. They're below 5. They might even be 2 or 3 kilograms. So that's a low carbon crop on the whole spectrum. And even if you do regenerative agriculture, maybe you're measuring the soil carbon sequestration. Well, maybe then it's getting even lower. It's like 1 kilogram or 0.5 or 0.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emitted per kilogram. That's very low carbon. But instead of just saying that and comparing the baseline to 0, as if that's the goal, what you're saying is in each place, we need to know what could the actual baseline be if this were prairie, if this were rainforest, if this were temperate climate, which are actually in many cases massively carbon sequestering. And so then oats don't come out, they still are low compared to cows, but they're not necessarily as far as we could go towards carbon sequestering intact ecosystem. And having that front and center is sort of the idea of the forest delta, that we should actually be changing our framing of how we look at any life cycle assessment around carbon footprint, to say not how close is it to 0, but how close is it to what an intact ecosystem or an agroforestry version of that could create.
And that is what we need to think about, right? When we think about the human emitted carbon, and we think about the order of magnitude of that, the megatons or gigatons of human emitted carbon or human action emitted carbon, it's dwarfed by the global system. And those global systems, our ability to manipulate those global systems has been shown over and over again. And this is one of those areas. So not measuring it is actually severing the logical or the intellectual connection between what is going on the ground and what our ability to act is, right? So for every hectare of agriculture that is effectively close to zero, like oats, let's say, right? Oats is pretty much zero. I mean, oats are awesome. But that is a hectare that is not fighting global warming for us by being at zero. And so we should be owning that fact. We should be responding to that fact, and that, you know, we need a certain number of hectares to feed ourselves, and there are different ways of utilizing those hectares, and there are different ways of managing those hectares for our different purposes, some of which may need to be have a negative impact on global warming, and some of which may be able to be managed in a way that help us fight global warming really well. And making that choice available via LCA is a very grounded, clear addition to the current LCA science that makes use of the research that has already been done so well for things like land use change. Like, land use change looks different in Manitoba already within LCA software than it does in Brazil, for exactly the same reason.
And so there has been, we have heard something, it's not quite this, but a different angle on it, where people basically say, and this has been some of the recent criticism and pushback against the promise of regenerative agriculture, is people have said, well, no, you should just not use that land for agriculture. You should put it into forest. It should be naturally regenerating forest or prairie or whatever it is in that ecosystem instead of your agricultural use. And so this ends up as this sort of butting heads between, quote unquote, agriculture and farming and, quote unquote, you know, nature conservationists. And part of the potential that we're seeing here in taking a different measure, a different baseline with our life cycle assessments, is that it would push us to see those places where we could actually do both, where we could have agricultural production while also sequestering more carbon towards what a quote unquote conserved ecosystem would be, which in some cases doesn't even work exactly in places that have been over compacted, over damaged by agriculture. Just taking it out of agriculture and leaving it alone, it's a very slow build up back to forest, back to prairie.
Right. You could definitely, there are places you could build faster, but also, I mean, back to that debate, you know, that debate is coming into place because the impact of unmanaged land is important and is under-recognized by those of us in agriculture, because it's a scary thing to accept that it's so much better. And so measuring that makes it a conversation about when and where and how, rather than a debate, right? We need both. And unmanaged forest is an amazing thing. Managed forest is an amazing thing. Managed ecosystems are amazing things. And managed farmland that approximates the positive impacts from a biodiversity, from a carbon output, from a carbon input of forest that's a target we want, right? We want to see if we can push towards that. When White Oaks Pastures comes out with an LCA done by Qantas about how much carbon it's sequestering, I want to know how much carbon can be sequestered by the forest next door in Georgia, right? Is he beating that? Is he not even close to it? Is he halfway there? Like, those are brilliant questions, and they allow us to map usage, land usage, to strategize about land usage in whole new ways, to realize, oh, you know what, that Mediterranean climate, that actually has very low capacity for carbon storage in the soil. So that's an amazing place to keep doing the long-term slow burn perennial agriculture that's already there, because it's pretty much taking care of the soil and it wouldn't change much anyway. So that's an amazing place for food production, as in certain versions of how it's working now. And other versions that are creating massive soil loss, it's the only thing that's going there, And there's never going to be the biomass to recreate that in the next million years. So let's stop doing that, right? Things like that get really fun from a global understanding of where to support agriculture, where to support unmanaged ecology, where to support a mix between the two, and where nothing should be happening. We're just making it worse.
Right. So we'd love to start opening it up to questions. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And if you have a complex question you don't want to type out, you could also just raise your hand here. I've got a few more, but we're happy to hear others either clarifying or sort of pushing the logic further on this. What would be, you talked about it a little bit there, Arthur, but what would be some of the implications of this forest delta way of thinking, this kind of reframing of, in a way, what the goal is, what's possible for carbon sequestration in a place? What are the implications for something like, for some forms of animal agriculture, like for grazing, or some of the claims that have been made about regenerative grazing, some of the science we've seen about regenerative grazing? What are the implications there?
I think the implications become, it just becomes a new baseline, right? Zero is not an interesting baseline. We need this very rich consumption of carbon and sequestration of carbon and release of carbon. That's ongoing constantly, right? And getting to zero, it's good for very human activities, but activities that are in this in between of like human and ecological, that are not mechanical, like agriculture, they don't exist at zero, and they shouldn't, right? And we can, so it changes the baseline. It changes the baseline across the board, but for animal agriculture and for regen animal agriculture specifically, I think it really, it puts together two things. One, it really shows where that form of agriculture stands, and whether it's going to be better or worse than let's say regenerative oats. And so like it will give us a spectrum, right? If that becomes normal across many forms of analysis, it gives us a spectrum that actually matters, not a spectrum of where we're not just doing less harm than we were before. We can see where we're improving, we can see what's worth it. But I think the other thing that it does is it fully engages the total land use debate, right? If we are responsible for the non-carbon sequestration of land we are managing that isn't forest, for any amount of failure to sequester carbon that would have otherwise been sequestered, that's the conversation about, like, if regenerative beef takes 30% more acreage than grain beef total, then that's where that would come into play. That's where that measurement would happen, right? And if you're on established, mature agricultural land, that conversation's not happening. There's no land use change measure. There's no land use change implied there. So that conversation's there. So we're missing part of that conversation. And that part of that conversation, we are the very aggressive desire to reduce the number of land is an important conversation to be having. And if that is not invited by our LCA process, then we're missing something. And so for me, part of what's interesting is it fully incorporates that. It incorporates that on an acre by acre or hectare by hectare basis, but it also incorporates that on larger management. If you're doing a whole statewide management, you're really seeing, or a countrywide management strategy, you're really seeing what those hectares or acres could be doing.
So I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to share a diagram here that has just, I wasn't planning on showing it, but it came to mind as we've been talking through this, and helps to sort of set the scale a little bit. It's also some really excellent data that I don't think has been as widely held and put into use in the larger regenerative agriculture community. So I want to put this up there so that you can see it. And then after that, and Arthur will kind of respond to it, then we'll do a quick breakout to generate some questions here, but I want to put this up because I think it's really fascinating. This is from the Carbon Farming Solution, which is one of the best books on this topic that's out there by Eric Tonsmeyer. And it basically shows 4 different agricultural practices. What are the rates of carbon sequestration that we have seen, and also according to what sorts of studies figured it out. So here you see tons of carbon per hectare per year that are captured, and then you can see on the left side going up these different practices. So crop rotation, yeah, it sequesters a bit of carbon, that's great. Cover cropping, it does a little bit. Doing some conventional no-till, there's a bit of a range you can do here, but that's nothing compared to, for example, compost on rangeland. Here's a really important one where just putting high carbon compost out can actually change a huge amount and sequester a lot of carbon. But then as you get further up here, you're getting into more and more perennial agriculture-based systems, more and more agroforestry that is closer to that. It's getting closer to the forest delta. It's getting closer to what would have happened if you let this revert to a natural forest or to a natural prairie. You see things like silvopasture, the combination of pasture with trees, especially with intensive rotational grazing, and you get 5 to 10 tons of carbon per hectare per year. You can go even further and see that even some even monocultures of bamboo or of leucaena, which is a legume, a tropical legume, those can sequester huge amounts of carbon per year. And then as you get up into woodlot polycultures, that's very similar to this, the forest delta, what we've been talking about, an intact ecosystem regenerating, that's very high, that's over 15. Multi-strata agroforestry systems can be really significant. These are these woody polyculture. So this helps you to sort of see the whole span of what's possible and puts into perspective the really good work that can come from regenerative organic agriculture, from conservation agriculture, from even just putting manure out, and some of the agriculture-based practices. Here we're moving into livestock systems, but then as you start to combine your agriculture with trees, you're getting greater and greater carbon sequestration that's there. So Arthur, I'd love to hear your just thoughts, response to this in context of what we're talking about here with the forest delta.
I mean, I think one of the most important things, having put this up, is for me to mention Eric Tonsmeyer's work and the Carbon Farming Solution as a huge inspiration for these ideas, right? And seeing this and being aware of this and realizing that, like, our reduction in carbon output is as important as how much carbon the world absorbs on an annual basis, and our responsibility in playing into that. And that has come from this conversation, right? Carbon Farming Solution, carbon farming as a conversation is definitely a huge inspiration for what started that. So I just, as soon as you put this up here, I felt like, oh, I feel like I should have mentioned him. And I actually ran these ideas past him earlier in the year because of the importance of figuring out how to incorporate this. So because we see, because there's so many areas here that we already have enormous number of acres in, where if standard practice cacao can sequester 7 tons of carbon per hectare per year, you're in an area where a company responsible for hundreds of thousands of hectares of cacao sourcing, through encouraging slightly improved management practices, could be up to 12, 15 tons possibly, right? And that, for us, I want us to start thinking about this as a way of actively balancing carbon output in other places, right? For us to start this conversation of, oh, okay, our chocolate production is across 15,000 acres, and we're increasing that. We're increasing the amount of sequestration 10% across 15,000 acres, and we're responsible for that. So we're going to include that in our own measurement of our activities. Is a very cool conversation to have. But then to understand that in the context of whether you're still actually 5 tons a year less than forest in that same area would be producing, or whether you're outproducing, out-sequestering forest in that area, that puts it in real context. Then you're talking about the real world in an LCA. And that's like, you know, that's where reading an LCA, you might not have the technical understanding to understand every single part, but as you're seeing it, the more you know, the more you can see that it's reflecting the way the actual world works. And that's just really exciting.
So if you got a question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat or something like that. Anyone got something for Arthur? I have a question for him if nobody else does, but if you got one, yeah, just put your hand up. All right, go ahead. Let me see. I got to take you off mute. Hold on. Max, you should be able to unmute there. There you go. Go for it.
I got maybe a third of the way through presenting my question to my group when we left. So I'll just state it to the group at large. So I guess my question is really about the what next of it all. So the model you proposed today is super interesting, and I'm wondering kind of where might that be applied today already, and or kind of where should we be thinking after today's call, the kind of lowest hanging fruit energy needs to be applied in order to get to a place where land managers are actually kind of optimizing towards their individual land, you know, that kind of long-term objective of optimizing towards individual land kind of best use. So yeah, kind of the short term of it all.
I mean, that's a really difficult question. I don't know that I have a good answer to it. I think, you know, the geeky part of me just wants to say, I don't know, I just keep measuring it and then other people figure out how they're going to apply it, because that's not my job. But I mean, I think we have modeled numbers for a lot of different environments, right? It is very possible to understand what your likely top-end carbon storage capacity per hectare is in any climate and use case in general terms. And so establishing that as a target and starting to popularize measurement or proxies for measurement is what I would be most excited about, right? There are people who are bringing down the price of carbon measurement, soil carbon and biomass estimate measurement tools down towards into the hundreds of dollars, and they're going to get lower and lower, right? And so if people have a target and they have a way of measuring it, then they start working towards it, right? I mean, that's why you have biohackers sticking their own vaccines into themselves, right? Because people will work towards it, and it doesn't always work, and sometimes it's terrifying, but people will do it. So I think if we can popularize the conversation and popularize the capacity to measure, even a proxy for measurement, if it's a good proxy, a trustworthy proxy, that actually becomes enough for people to start testing and moving in a general direction. But the problem is, it has to be policy, right? Like that for individual land managers, that sounds great to me. But the fact is that the reason why I really want to get into to reshaping the way we actually do the LCAs and not just have this conversation is because when this starts going through the academic routes and then getting into in the US cooperative extensions, in Europe the agricultural support country by country there, you start getting on-farm consultations where they're encouraging practices that actually support farmers and support these methods. And when they get normalized and they become part of the bureaucracy, it's boring but it spreads to hundreds of thousands and then millions of hectares. And that's, you know, I mean, that's the scale that we measure devastation on. And so that's the scale that I want to measure success on.
I'll give one other kind of shorter term answer, which is that HowGood in our Lattice impact platform is going to be starting to offer a way to see this, not just to see the carbon impact as is, but to say, do you want to put a forest delta lens on it so you can understand your impact compared to that? So that's one place we'll be putting it out there to make available to our partners. Also, just picking up a question from Rossi here in the chat. We've gone back and forth and used many different units in this conversation. The chart that I showed of tons per hectare per year is in metric tons.
Yeah, we do almost everything metric. I mean, aside from slipping into acres here and there, because just stuck in it and having a land-based existence in the US, we forget. Everything else, we're all metric all the time, except for client output when it's not going to be acceptable.
Okay, there's a question from Eva. Basically, what are the implications of this forest delta approach outside of carbon sequestration, for example, to biodiversity?
The implications are huge. The measurement of biodiversity is much less mature than our measurement of carbon and CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, especially. And so they are not, it would have to be measured separately. A lot of the same behaviors would be better for biodiversity than current behaviors. But it's more like the forest delta approach fully on its own set of metrics from a biodiversity understanding would probably do a very similar thing. But I don't know the numbers as well. And I think it would be even harder to create the baseline. So it would be very exciting, very impactful, and very difficult.
Okay. If there's any other questions, you can raise your hand or pop them in the chat. If not, I'm going to take a direction that sort of goes on from here with a lot of what we're talking about is a more flexible, faster way. One of the things about life cycle assessment that is amazing is how comprehensive it is. But that also makes it that takes a significant amount of time, and you've got to gather a lot of data, and there's so many little variables that you can make a decision at one point and that influence the whole rest of the report. And so when you get a final static life cycle assessment report, maybe it took 6 months, maybe it took 9 months, maybe it took a year to create. Some things may be already a little bit out of date. The science is really tight, detailed, and good, but maybe it lacks a little bit in the sort of flexibility and usability, especially for some of our partners in the food and health and beauty, product design and manufacturing space. They're needing a little more quick ability to assess what would happen if you did this, or if you tried this, if you changed this in this way. So Arthur, I wonder if you could just briefly, only have a couple minutes here, but just kind of talk about this idea you've had of a living LCA, and what that would look like and how it'd be different from the current approach.
I mean, this is, I mean, yes, I can happily talk about this. This is my kind of favorite thing that we're working towards modeling, which is LCAs as they work now have very clear inflection points, right? We know exactly what is likely to increase or decrease in LCA significantly for a given type of LCA. So within agriculture, our primary interest, fertilizer is going to be huge, land use change is going to be huge, different methods of animal husbandry will have certain implications, prevalence of storage needs for a given crop will have implied materials needs for those buildings and so on. And all of those places almost mechanisms are the main places we measure, right? It's very little is about the crop itself. It's crop type and methodology and required inputs to meet that crop type's need within the methodology. And those things are modelable. We have models for those. And so what we're working on building is what we're calling internally a Living Lca, which is the ability to have all of the options where you can change the model basically with their own equalizer. So you can say, okay, let's say, go back to the beef example, our beef is pastured for 6 months or for 10 months and then is on a CAFO for 6 months. Or our beef is pastured and you can just change it to 12 months and shrink the time on the CAFO to 4 months or keep it the same. Or you can change the method on pasture and say, not only is our beef on pasture for 10 months, but it's on rotationally grazed pasture and where it's in a temperate zone. So you can pick all of these things, and all of those major inflection points you would be able to change to actually see what that impact is. So you could see the difference, not just between, say, high rainfall and low rainfall for totals or just for a given year, but also pick your management method or pick whether within a management method you needed the high end or the low end of the fertilizer applications. So you're able to see what your ranges within your own methods are, but also then see what the possible impacts by choosing different methods are, and to actually drag those and just see where it affects it, right? And to go, okay, for beef, choosing rotational grazing has a pretty big impact, but actually shortening the life of the animal has a much bigger impact, or whatever it is. Like nobody, right now it's so difficult to know across different crops where the changes work and where they don't work. And so to model them and actually make them editable by the user allows the user to test that and say, okay, we're going for this, because over and over again, when we focus on applying high carbon compost, even though it's in a totally otherwise normal system, it has a bigger impact than any of the other standards or modifications we are choosing. And so we've been playing with that, and that's in a really exciting direction we're going internally. And yeah.
All right, well, look forward to hearing more on Living Lcas from us and the systems to implement them and make them easy to use. Thanks everyone for joining today. There's one upcoming call with Juan Lucas Restrepo of the Biodiversity Alliance on October 22nd. And this conversation has been recorded, and we will get it up on howgood.com/online soon and send you an email. Thanks everyone for participating. Bye.